Every once in a while, I have to rent a car, and if I get one with an excellent suspension, I can't tell how fast I'm driving. So I think something like that is happening with generative AI. According to Reuters, ChatGPT reached an estimated 100 million active monthly users in the first 2 months. That's faster than TikTok, which took 9 months, and Instagram, which took 2.5 years. It's not slowing down, and we might be going too fast. Hey there, I'm your host, Ayodele Lobos, a software engineer and senior staff instructor at LinkedIn Learning. And today we're talking to Ayodele Odubela, a data scientist, machine learning professional, and AI entrepreneur. Hello, Ayodele.
Hey Ray, how are you doing?
I am doing great. I'm so happy that you're here. I wish everybody could watch the pre-show because it's so cool. I learned so much good stuff. I'm super excited about this topic. It's not the thing that I think we're talking about, how it's not the thing that necessarily people think is exciting, but I think you're going to be really pleased. I learned so much from just doing like all the research for the episode this week. So let's get into it. First thing I usually talk about is I do a poll for the show every week. And so this is the poll that I created for this show. So this asked basically, what do you think is the biggest ethical issue generative AI will create in society? And we're going to touch on all these topics, but I just want to get your thoughts, Ayodele, on what you thought about the results for the poll.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised, but not entirely. I definitely think misinformation is a huge issue. But there's some other big ones in here, like job displacement. That is one of the most tangible, actual harms that we can look at. And it'll be interesting to dive in, and I'm very curious to see what some other people are thinking around what generative AI issues we're going to see in the short term and the long term, and how we're going to try and mitigate around those.
Yeah, totally. I think that I was also super surprised just because, as you can see, and I hate that this happens, but the very first person that votes on these is me. And I'm like, oh, which one should I pick? I come up with the question. And you could see that I said privacy was the biggest issue I thought. But that was really one of the least, I guess, popular results of the poll. And I think I'm always surprised by the poll results. I don't know what it is. I always think of the questions, but I feel like I always get the answer wrong in some way. So as usual, you can ask questions in the chat, and it looks like at least the chat in I can see the chat in LinkedIn. There was some sort of problem last time with the chat itself, but it looks like it's working. So I think that if you want to, you can also watch this on YouTube, and I can pull those chats, those questions up a little bit better if you actually end up watching it on YouTube. So let's talk a little bit about where this concept of responsible AI comes in. I think that when you get a question like this, a lot of people have some preconceptions. So can you define what you mean by responsible AI?
Yeah, the first thing I really think about with responsible AI is accountability. How are we tracing the impacts on society back to the organizations that have created the technology, the cultures around this, and really being able to take accountability as far as offering things like financial recourse. Like, we are unfortunately at an age where AI has caused damage already. We've seen people who have been mistakenly arrested. We've seen people who are denied for mortgage loans. And so when we have these really high stakes applications, we need ways for people to dispute some of the outcomes of a model or really find out more information about why that decision was made. And we only really have that in like regulated industries like finance right now, and we need to expand that beyond just finance and really be responsible as an organization for how we deploy AI tools and some of the consequences that may not be positive that come with that.
Yeah, part of the problem is I feel that this is happening so fast, as I mentioned, and I don't think anybody, including ChatGPT, thought that they were going to be so, I don't know, so embedded into the culture so quickly. I know that ChatGPT. I saw an interview of Sam Altman, the CEO for OpenAI, and he mentioned that he was wondering why nobody had built something like ChatGPT because it is basically a an application based on an existing API that they have. So they just went ahead and did it, and it just got crazy sort of reaction from everybody. It gained 1 million users in 5 days. So that I don't know that it was expected. So it just looks like we're barreling down the road, and perhaps we haven't thought enough about sort of the potential issues that could happen. So let's talk about some of the issues that we covered on the poll. So why would you say it's a concern that generative AI is capable of introducing bias into results?
Yeah, one of the biggest issues with generative AI specifically is that it comes up with something that we classify as new. It may be a new combination of words or a new image, but we don't really think about that critically and that it's not truly new. Um, ChatGPT looks at large bodies of text and then creates responses based off of the input. But it's interesting when we start to look at what this text it's trained on contains, and a lot of it is really biased. It might be hateful comments on YouTube or Reddit, and it's really difficult without like very strong guardrails to tell a generative AI system to not look at the underlying human biases or not include any of the subtleties. So even now, if you were to ask ChatGPT, hey, build a function that helps me identify a strong engineer, that function will come up with if race is white and if gender is male, true, and all else false. It's very
Hmm.
easy. Just a lot of what the text on the internet is kind of toxic. And I think when we recognize that, we can start to say maybe that's not the best place to train a language model. But we can't expect to train it on that data, not really do much as far as mitigating the hate or the toxicity there,
Hmm.
and then create a generative model and expect that it doesn't reflect the same kind of issues that are raised in the training text.
So one thing that I thought was super interesting about doing the research and watching your course was that it's not that I didn't realize, but I wasn't thinking that the data that you gather or that GPT and any model you gather data, that data is going to have whatever bias happened as a result of where it came from, and you do talk about this in your course. So you have to start by understanding that you can't rely on, like, if somebody built an AI from all of the comments in Twitter, it would be probably a really horrible AI because people can be really honest in Twitter. So think about, can you maybe talk a little bit about that, and maybe if you have an understanding of where some of these tools get all that information from?
Yeah, I think that is one of the huge issues is the data itself. Unfortunately, social media has been pretty well documented as a breeding ground for some of the worst comments. This isn't just around like race or gender. A lot of times it's xenophobic content or homophobic and transphobic content. And unfortunately, these social media platforms haven't really been held to a standard of regulating this type of content on the platform. So it's very common that we scrape the internet. Like most data science students have scraped some platform at some point in time, whether it's for their own tweets or specific hashtags, to then create projects. So that's very ingrained in our like psyche of how we develop new AI. And so unless we go through and really try to eliminate these comments, or eliminate things that tend to lean more hateful, it's not to say we weed out everything negative, but unless we're specifically aiming to remove that, whatever we create is going to basically mimic or parrot everything that it's fed. So AI, kind of tend to see it as a black box or see it as magic, and it truly is just pattern recognition.
Hmm.
If I show it, all of Elon Musk's tweets and ask it to generate even a tweet that's general, it's going to sound like he wrote it. But that's not the only major issue. Like the training data is a huge part of it, but then the development team and how they've chosen to mitigate that is part of it. The context in which that we created it is also part of the issue. So we that kind of leads us into the privacy part is that we sign the terms of use of these platforms, post our data, and then unfortunately we feel like it belongs to us when it can train a model and then they can make money off of that. So
Mm.
um, there's a whole kind of like flow of potential issues where bias comes into play. And if you're a company that's truly looking to like make a model and sell it, um, you're not as concerned about fixing some of these problems because that's not your major priority. Your priority might be gaining the user base to be able to profit from it.
That's so interesting. I can never now forget the Elon GPT model, and now of course I'm now thinking of like the Trump GPT and the you name it GPT. I mean, it reminds me. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Galaxy Quest. It's like a old science fiction movie. And the interesting thing about that movie is that the aliens watched all these like 1970s shows, and they built their entire culture based on the
Mhm.
broadcasts of the shows at the time. And so it's really interesting because that's kind of what we're seeing with ChatGPT. If you like look at all the data that came from the internet and where these systems get their information, then you definitely understand that they have biases built in. So let's talk about privacy because I think you touched on it a little bit, and you sent me this really awesome article. So let me put that up in here. So you sent me this article about the IRS starting to require or thinking about requiring facial recognition to access tax returns. And so this article talks about it. I'll put all the links in the chat as well. Now, the interesting thing about this is thankfully you sent me another article that talked about how they found the error of their ways and they decided to drop the facial scan recognition for verification. Can you talk a little bit about, what happened here and how maybe that's a good sort of, I don't know, case study for,
Yeah,
somebody not understanding the ramifications of what could happen?
absolutely. So, them thinking about using ID Me was kind of uh, difficult for a lot of the like technical people in our community because one, we've had really great studies that demonstrate how facial recognition performs poorly, specifically for people with dark skin and specifically for dark skinned women. And so the Gender Shades Project, which was Joy Bulamwini and Timnit Gebru, really exposed this. And unfortunately, after highlighting that, we saw some organizations like Amazon really kind of causing a lot of friction with the results of that. Microsoft and a couple others choosing to pause work on facial recognition or really think about how the context in which they use it and try to improve their systems. And so when we saw like the IRS start to consider this, it wasn't just a software thing. It was something that, we can't opt out of being like audited by the IRS. There's no recourse, unfortunately, with many systems that are used by the federal government, and there's no way to remove our like bio information from these systems. So
Hmm.
not only is the tool itself flawed, one of the biggest wins here was that it take a lot of work from Joy Bulamwini specifically in her Algorithmic Justice League, petitioning the IRS, writing them and saying that the use of this tool is going to be harmful, especially when deployed on like 330 million people,
Yeah.
and requiring it and requiring um, bioinformation we're just not at the point where these tools are stable enough, reputable. Unfortunately, most facial recognition isn't based within true science, and it's typically trained on data sets that don't include a lot of Black people and Black women, highlighted by gender shades. That was one of their biggest points. Was when you look at the common facial recognition photo data sets, Faces in the Wild has actually been retracted from public use because it wasn't diverse enough to create tools that would work for the diversity of like the human race. So I'm so glad that that was a win for like the responsible AI community so that we're all not subject to this. Like, being a dark skinned woman myself, I have issues with facial recognition tools. I don't show up the same way as other people. I deal with quality of service harms because a tool that works well for one person doesn't work as well for me. And it's not just AI. Once we kind of realize it's broader systems like hardware systems, this has been demonstrated by like these soap dispensers that don't work if you have dark
Mhm.
skin. It's not just limited to AI and it's not new because of AI. And I think once we realize the deep history there, it's easier to say, let's be more critical about this when it's something that everyone in the country has to use or be subject to. And the mess it would cause for them of having to try and reconcile like issues with the facial recognition and not with the tax returns themselves, I think they realized that was not going to be helpful.
Yes, our message to our S, if you're watching, is we love you, and also slow down. Look,
Yes, please.
think about it. Think about it.
Right.
I think that it speaks to the rush to just sort of use some of this data and some of these things that they need to sort of slow down and really think about policies and ways of doing things responsibly. So one of the other topics that I thought surely this is going to be number one is the topic of that a lot of people consider AI as being something that is maybe potentially eliminating their jobs. I think that there's definitely going to be some displacement. Some jobs might be eliminated. How do we create a path that is both responsible for humans, but also takes into account some of the transition that needs to happen in the economy?
Yeah. I think this is one that's really difficult because we tend to look to just the engineers themselves.
Mm,
But engineers aren't working in a vacuum. You're within an organization with a specific direction and priorities. And when we start to consider that, we can see that we need a little bit of a shift away from things that are potentially going to eliminate jobs, especially given where we are in the economy, where we are with inflation. um, I think it's fairly objective to say that tools that can displace workers right now are pretty harmful to society as a whole. But I think unfortunately, that's not something that teams are thinking about when they're building these tools. And I think that's really driven by hype because
mm,
we wouldn't see like the elimination of jobs as an issue if AI weren't so hyped as being the next best thing or the thing you have to use in your organization that builds that pressure on orgs to say, oh, well, we got to start using AI. We're not
mhm,
keeping up with our competitors. I think if we got past the hype and we're really honest about the capabilities, the limitations of these tools, I think more orgs would recognize it's not really going to replace human efforts. Even with ChatGPT, it's really easy to come up with the wrong answers. You can say, what's 2 plus 5? And it'll say, oh, it's 9. And unless you know better, you're going to take that answer and run with it. And that's very obvious to get around. We know what 2 plus 5 might be. But when we're thinking in the broader context of copywriting or writing books or things that just require a human level of pattern recognition and understanding, it doesn't truly replace what a human can do. So I think we tend to get excited about these tools, and there's a lot of news around them, but they don't really replace humans in the way we think they will. And a lot of times when we've tried to get rid of all the people, bring in all of the AI. A lot of those efforts actually fail and they find out, oh, this isn't delivering the way I want it to. There's a very common quote in like data science that 80% of machine learning projects fail in entirety. And so much
Hmm.
of that is because we can't make AI at the same uh, level of human understanding for things like radiology, for
Hmm.
traffic, for so many things that it takes a human mind to be able to do. Um, we're not there yet. We're not there yet with
Yes.
AI,
I think that if
unfortunately.
you think that it can replace people, you should go try it because as a developer, I mean, one of the sort of big news is that it's assisting developers, with code, and people think that it's going to like write all the apps and we're all going to lose our jobs. And if you're a developer and you have tried it, you can see that sort of level of accuracy that it has and how you do need to be careful because for one thing, and this speaks to the bias as well, it's trained on data from 2021 and earlier. So it doesn't know about, like I was talking last week to Jerome, the guest in the show, that it doesn't know about like the new, say, React concurrency or some of the newer frameworks. Like that is deadly to a developer working with data that is at least a year old or more. That has an impact on the kind of responses that it's going to give you. So although it can be pretty useful in a lot of situations, it's not there yet. I'm not sure that it's going to be yet. That's one of the reasons that I really love open AI's sort of goals are not to replace humanity, but really to assist humanity, which I think is the right approach and really a great ethical approach. So let's get to the top concern in the poll was about misinformation. Bots have been a problem in social media way before things like ChatGPT. I feel like there is a lot of potential for misuse right here. What do you expect that bots creating misinformation might be capable of doing once they start taking advantage of some of these new tools?
I think the biggest potential issue is really this regurgitation of hate speech.
Mm,
When we start to think about, if we're looking just at social media bots, if we start to think about the objectives and the things that do lead to revenue, it is about users and engagement. And I think
mhm,
bots have been a way to make a platform appear like they have more active users.
mm,
I'm less concerned about their ability, but more concerned about how they will essentially reinforce a lot of these social media bubbles. Like on YouTube,
mm,
if you start going down the alt right lane, you will get more of that content suggested to you. Um, with bots in particular, I think that we're actually going to start to see more regulation sooner rather than later.
mhm,
Um, because misinformation has been it has been a problem for a few years, and I honestly expected a little bit more after Cambridge Analytica,
mm,
after the 2016 election. I figured we would do more to get a handle on it, and this laissez-faire attitude of like letting each organization handle it on their own with a moderation team. I think that's going to go away, and I think we'll start to see regulation start really with social media platforms stating how bots can be used and maybe limiting their abilities to like moderate or comment updates and things that are functionally focused rather than really being able to post the wide array of content like we have currently. I think that's going to be honestly our best path towards mitigating this problem because right now it's still pretty unsolved. We don't have a great handle on it yet, and I think unfortunately we take this techno solutionism route. Well, if there's misinformation, let's just add a feature flag, or add a feature that flags it as misinformation. But the outcome doesn't really lead to a societal like mindset shift, and it doesn't enable us to actually be critical about it. We are
mm.
still, unfortunately, reading things at face value, um, not looking into the context. And I think that we just have to curb that entirely. And I think we'll start to see a lot more regulation about misinformation this year as well.
Yeah, I think the thing that kind of concerns me is just the capacity of bots to generate massive amounts of information. I think that, we've seen sort of things that I feel like up to now you've seen that bots you can easily tell when it's kind of a bot because it's comments that are very short and don't make a lot of sense. But with the capacity of very much sounding like a person, I think you can massively generate just incredible amounts of things that do appear to be people starting to generate just a different level of misinformation that we haven't seen before. All we programmers talk about like a DDoS attack, which is a denial of service that just happens because of the massive amounts of traffic that you can have some tools generate. So I'm concerned about the technical aspects of how these bots can not just flood any network with information, but it can sound pretty convincing and it can seem pretty human at times. So we'll see where that goes.
One of my biggest fears around that is that um, even for teams of moderators, it's hard to identify that if you are not an expert in that area of misinformation, or if you're not using a
Hmm.
GP like text generated like attempting to use a tool to classify it as generative
Hmm.
text. It's going to be really difficult to fight. And even like in the old school days of the web, like the auto filtering and spam filtering, unless they are partnering with like OpenAI to try and find generative text, it's going to be a challenge.
It's like a cold war of the spammers versus the people that wrote better bots for spamming. And I think that's kind of what scares me, that you may have some sort of AI battle as to we've seen new tools appear as a result of something like ChatGPT that are designed to detect the overuse of ChatGPT. But somebody's going to write a tool to, mitigate the detection of
Yeah.
somebody using ChatGPT, and then somebody will write something that will mitigate the mitigation, and will just be, it's pretty much like a spam fight, I think, all over again. So, speaking, I think in one of the courses that you did, you mentioned that people aren't really sure about who would be responsible for crafting, a reasonable AI policy. Is that always the role of somebody like a CEO?
I do think the CEO's role is really setting the foundation and helping to make some of the crucial decisions. So, for
Hmm.
example, if we look at just fairness, which is one like aspect of responsible AI, there are multiple definitions of fairness, I think like 50, and
Hmm.
they
Wow.
several of these definitions contradict each other directly. So I do think it's always the role of leadership to be informed. And I'm not saying you got to read through like 50 definitions, but have a broad understanding of what's important in your organization, whether that's group fairness, each group within a specific attribute like race is treated fairly, or do you want to treat all similar individuals alike with an individual fairness? I do think it's important for leaders to be able to set those decisions, document them, and make sure that how they're building and developing AI really matches with that. And so a lot of times that also means that you are auditing your systems for these types of unfairness, which is something that orgs are just not used to doing. We are in like step zero point 0.1 when it comes to really operationalizing responsible AI. But I think leadership needs to be able to set the tone, or really guide the development principles,
Hmm. Hmm.
but turning those principles into actual changes to their development workflow and processes, rather than like a web page about it, but not really taking the steps to make sure that that's part of their engineering process.
Yes, you definitely don't want the CEO to micromanage these kind of decisions, but make sure that they establish frameworks by they will be taken care of. I was thinking that 50 people, 50 different opinions on fairness sounds pretty much like one of my family's Christmas parties, pretty much.
I'm
so
sure.
So one of the courses that you did that I really enjoyed, and as I was researching this, I was really struck by was this course that you did on the foundations of responsible AI, and you do talk in here about some of the frameworks. I found really interesting that you talked about the different ethical frameworks like consequentialism, utilitarianism, deontology, pragmatism, moral relativism. So, what is the role when companies are maybe looking at some of these ethical frameworks? What's the role of transparency about how they are viewing the world? How do you see, crafting a strategy and being, letting people know how you think of the world and what you're using as a framework for thinking?
Yeah. I think transparency is incredibly key, but right now it's kind of one of those unfulfilled principles that few orgs have really, I don't want to say checked the box, but achieved yet. So I think about it in two major ways. And the first is transparency towards users. So they should
Hmm.
be able to understand when you sign on to a platform or use a tool, what machine learning is being used on you,
Hmm.
what kinds of decisions are being made, how often is that refreshed? Are they, getting rid of some of that data after a certain point in time? Because I think ultimately the goal of responsible AI is like financial compensation for cases where we've harmed people. So you
Hmm.
didn't get a mortgage loan. Here is, I think the full process would end with actual recourse. And so
Mm.
can't dispute a decision if you don't know one's being made. And I'm on the internet a lot, like I'm sure a lot of other people. I have never seen a disclosure saying, we're making these predictions about you. So that's the first like slice of transparency is
I
truly
feel like
being.
some companies maybe might be a little scared of letting people know how they're making those decisions. I don't know what you think about that.
I absolutely think they are because that opens the door for questioning.
Mm.
And it's easier, and I hate saying this, but the reason is because they don't have the answers. And as
Mm.
someone who's worked on building it many types of machine learning projects, um, I can't always say why it made a decision. If we're looking at deep learning issues, I can point out some weights and some layers and some factors, but we can't easily say, well, we made this decision about you because of X. And I think that is the biggest fear that orgs
Mm.
have is that while that's hidden, there's two main benefits. One is competitive advantage. Their competitors
Mhm.
don't know what their it factor is. And secondly, is basically being able to hide from scrutiny, from users, from governments. It's easier to be clandestine about it and then not have to deal with any of the consequences. So I think that that's the biggest challenge is until we make it financially viable for orgs to do it, it's not something that that particularly serves the goals of their organizations. But I think the second part of transparency when we're thinking about this is really leaders having insight into how the models are truly built and understanding the, let's say, categories of text that feed ChatGPT. So, sure, there's lots of things from science and all of these papers, but how many of their millions, probably billions of text examples include hate speech?
Mm.
Being able to have a public document that tells people this is how we train this. This is a way for you to dispute these decisions. These are the outcomes that we've predicted about you. We're not really encouraged to be transparent, and I think that's one of the biggest things kind of holding us up from, I guess, achieving what we want to a world in which we know what decisions are automated about us and are able to fight those decisions when we don't feel like it's made the right choice around our data.
Yeah, and I feel that that is so important because when I was in sports, like I remember sometimes the coach would tell me something that I didn't agree with, But I knew where he was coming from. So it's easier if you understand where, the different companies and corporations stand, what their frameworks are, and the fact that they do have a model. I think, like you said, the problem right now is that everybody, they're probably just running around like crazy because they don't have a model. They haven't thought about it. They're trying to build it up. The thing is, taking over the conversations culturally, so they're trying to catch up to a moving target. I think
Mhm.
when the internet first came out, we saw that a lot of the government sort of tended to stay away from it and let it
Mhm.
kind of blossom. But that might be the wrong approach for this type of technology that has a lot of ramifications that you mentioned. So, oftentimes, like, the reason these things happen is because technologies think of doing things just because they can, not necessarily thinking about whether or not they should do something. You see that in the medical industry. It's one of the things you talked about in that Foundations of Responsible AI course. Something I'm super passionate about. I mentioned to you in the pre-show that I come from, Central America, lived in South America, Puerto Rico, all these different places. So I'm well aware that the things that you say in one place are not the things that you say in another place. How do you begin to program something like that? That sort of concept of social context, especially in a global environment where you have people with different standards, governments, ethics. How does that even work?
I think what's interesting is that my response to this is sometimes not popular because we can't program it.
Hmm.
And I think accepting that it takes this is the social part of like these socio-technical changes that we often talk about within responsible AI is that this is a social change and not something we can encode. So what I think it really takes is embracing an attitude of like localized responsible AI work and localized AI work in the broader sense. So um, we've tended to have this global perspective on building organizations, being headquartered in one place and having offices all over the world. And while that works for so many things, it is really difficult to build AI like that. A
Mm.
great example is actually with Roombas. So there was an incident where a Roomba ran over a woman's hair while she was sleeping and then causing pretty severe harm, like having to shave parts of her head, and the physical pain of actually like having your hair sucked into a vacuum. But one of the things that we've been able to identify as an issue is that this happened in India, where it's very common to sleep on the floor,
Mm.
and Roombas developed in North America. That's not really customary. So if you are a developer and you are thinking, well, a robot vacuum found hair, it probably should ingest it as trash. Like you want that to
Mhm.
be picked up. But without the context of some people sleep on the floor in other countries, you wouldn't see why that would be a conflict. And I think
Mm.
what's really key is that it's not that we are asking like a single engineering team to know the context and culture of every single country where people are able to buy their tools. But at the same time, it requires us to then say, okay, maybe we start approaching this from a country by country basis.
Mm.
Um, just like the different laws and regulations differ between countries, same thing for moral and ethics codes. Like the priorities we would take in North America are not the same priorities that society in Japan wants to. Like different cultures just value different things, whether that's the trolley problem and sparing the old or the young. Like there are various conflicts here that we can't just write rules for. So I think, unfortunately, we need to learn to be okay with these differences and then really localize these efforts, especially
Mm.
for things that have the potential to cause harm. And I think that's key is that we don't look at most of the things we build as having a potential to cause harm. And once we start looking at it from we assume this will cause harm until we can really prove that it won't, then we'll start to see a major difference in that maybe there's a couple things that don't cause harm, but I think we would maybe be more intentional about how we develop, and be intentional about developing a .uk, .au kind of version for a lot of the products that we build that use AI.
Yeah, and I think people probably need to understand that this isn't going to be a switch that you turn on. One of the eye-opening things when I was watching one of your courses, and this is another one of your courses on supervised learning essential training. I'm not a statistician and not an ML specialist, but it was really just fascinating to just see that you are actually talking about different tools, different models, frameworks that people have for solving, really complex statistical problems. To the average user, and probably not going to understand what all these like numbers and regression models and transformers, but to know that there is a sort of methodology for addressing mathematically and framework wise some of these issues, but it's not going to be like some sort of switch that you turn on and you let everybody know that you're looking at things a certain way. It's definitely going to be a process, and we need to start to implement those things right now. Start establishing the frameworks, start talking about transparency, start talking about how you solve those problems practically with a lot of the fantastic tools that we have, but that it's not going to be, you're not going to get it all tomorrow. And I think that companies are, they have a motive, a profit motive sometimes, but sometimes a societal or a government implemented sort of way of need for addressing things, because that's how the world works. We're going to be all right. Just
Yeah.
don't release the Elon GPT anytime soon if you can. Hold off on that. so, so next week I'm talking to Andreas Welsh about establishing strategies for businesses. I think it's a really cool topic, taking it, into the real world. These companies are the ones that are developing these different tools. And so there needs to be a balance, perhaps, between how we create a strategy that takes into account the business needs as well as the societal needs. So, what would you say are some of the top issues that businesses are facing when it comes to adopting these principles? What would you tell Andreas next week? What may be a question that you might have for him?
Yeah. Well, I would start with saying that orgs should really look into there's lots of tangible materials out there. So the biggest issue is translating principles into action, translating it into changes in the workflow, documentation, decisions that leadership needs to make. So being able to identify their priorities, whether that's fairness, if that's security, that's a huge aspect of making their principles legitimate, identifying what's relevant to them, finding the practical or the tangible technical solutions to them, whether that's leveraging the right Python packages for fairness. Um, I think those are going to be the biggest things to think about. And then the question I would ask is, what is the context of this? And is this high risk? Is this going to have a large impact on humans' life? Start thinking about things that way and then start to make a business strategy.
That's a really good idea. So you actually did send me a lot of resources. I'm just going to kind of go through some of them so that you can tell me a little bit about some of the, I mean, these are actually fantastic resources to talk about some of these issues. So I really enjoyed this particular site that you sent me about the NIST. This gave me hope. This to me was like somebody's actually been thinking about this. So tell me a little bit about what this is and what it does.
Yes. So NIST recently came out with a new AI risk management framework. And so this just goes in and explains a little bit of what they mean. It's a long document, but it's really meant to help organizations understand the areas of risk that are potential when they're building AI tools. And it really helps to guide how they can start thinking about mitigations, the regulations that are important, and trying to essentially create a standard so that we aren't just building AI all willy nilly and it's not the Wild West like it's been for a little bit. Um, So I think this one is really pertinent, especially for enterprise organizations, organizations in regulatory industries or regulated industries, but also for startups who are building AI. And let's be honest, are probably not total experts and need to recognize that standards are coming and that get organized sooner rather than later.
Yeah, this is really cool because I did really like that it's letting you know that people that have a technical, intelligence that is perhaps different than a developers are thinking about how do we actually solve these different issues. So I really like the fact that it's being built. So this is a great resource for somebody in business who maybe, let them know that this is a problem that everybody is working on. So you also send me this particular resource about reducing toxicity. I think this talks to basically how do you approach doing something like this and the fact that there's some resources here.
Yes, I love this because it goes a little bit more in detail about like some of the technical fixes, how to some of the APIs that are potentially that you can use to try and find harmful or toxic language. I think the one thing we're trying to solve with responsible AI at this early stage is that it seems like it's all theory for people, and people feel
Hmm.
like there's not a lot of um, real development work that can be done, but there's a lot that we can do. So I just wanted to highlight an example of a way to start thinking about toxic language and highlight that there are some APIs and some tools out there right now that they can use to start addressing this.
Yeah, this is really cool. I like that somebody has thought, that they have blacklists of words. So if you're looking into solving this problem, there's already that a lot of resources that you can use to start thinking about and also experimenting with. Like, developers love to have data to test, their applications with. So this is somebody's building something that's going to solve some of these problems. This is a great resource for them to take a look at. So I'm going to go to this independent audit of AI systems. I didn't have a chance to look at this before, but so maybe you can sort of fill me in on what this is.
Yeah, this is a wonderful resource. It's a course by For Humanity. And one of the big areas that we are really lacking in now is now that we're starting to see regulation that requires third party audits of AI tools, the biggest one being New York City's Local Law 144, which basically states for HR companies or companies that use automation in their decision in their hiring process, they have to start getting these algorithms audited by third parties. So this is a great course. It's one that I've done, but it really helps guide people who are technical. If you're a data scientist already or a statistician, it really outlines the parts of an AI audit, and really kind of is trying to train this next generation that of AI auditors that is incredibly needed based off of regulation, but we don't have yet. So, if you're interested in this space, I think this is going to be a really wonderful resource for people.
This is fantastic. I feel like one of those public service announcements saying, "There's help out there. If you're a developer or an ethicist, there's help." And these are
Absolutely.
some great resources. What is this Confirm Humanity?
Yeah, so it is a podcast I'm launching in the next few weeks. I'm
Oh,
really
super.
passionate about the data justice space, and I really want to highlight the stories from both the people who are working to fix these issues and the people who have been impacted. There are other great resources like Coded Bias that highlights how people in Brooklyn have had facial recognition put into their apartment buildings, and they did a lot of work to fight these things and really overcome some of the technology that was enforced on them that shouldn't have been. So there's a huge activist movement right now, really making sure that the people that are impacted by these algorithms have a voice and have a say in how those decisions about them are made. So I'm really excited about that.
That is really, really cool. All right. So you also have this thing here, practical data ethics. Huh.
Yes. So there's a couple really great, also like free online courses that help me set a foundation for myself on what does fairness mean? What do we mean by ethics in data science? And this is a really great resource by Fast AI. They have produced a lot of other machine learning and deep learning courses. But this data ethics course, I feel, really helped for me to reveal why things are the way they are, why we have this
Mhm.
culture around AI. And unfortunately, a lot of it stems from startup and VC influence on tech culture and on software. But this goes through various different issues in data ethics around disinformation, around privacy. So, for people who may not be as informed, I think it's a really great place to start understanding what are the general problems with data ethics right now.
Super cool. All right, let's see. I think we have so this. Let's talk about some of the courses that you have done for us. So you
Yeah,
actually did three courses, and I watched at least a lot of them,
thank
which
you.
I really enjoyed. And again, this is in my area of expertise, but they were very good. I thought you did a good job of making it accessible to somebody like me who is just thinking about these things, especially this foundations of responsible AI. Tech on the Go. This one's actually an audio only course, which I thought was really good because it's really talking about specific topics in you know in with this issues that I think people should really watch. Everybody should go and watch these first two. I think the foundations and this tech on the go. This is something you can watch like while you're driving somewhere. I think because it's an audio only course. The last one I think supervised learning essential training, a little bit more technical. Your target audience here, I think for me, the way that I saw it is just as a way of being able to see some of the models as a developer. That was super interesting, and how those models can be practically applied. So you have data here that you pull and you start doing, applying some of these different models that are pretty cool. I'm sure I couldn't do any of that myself, but this is like the thing that I mentioned. Yeah, maybe. Like, this is the thing that I mentioned that it's just giving me hope. Like my questions were like, how can anybody possibly, you know, understand math enough to solve this problem? And when I saw this course, it really kind of put me at ease. Oh, there's actually super intelligent professional statisticians and developers that are looking at this, and they have the tools necessary to make the mathematical, sort of, approaches that will make things better. And together with some of the ethical concepts and things that you talk in the other courses, I think is really, really good. So let's see. This is going to be difficult because I'm not seeing the LinkedIn questions, so I may need to just sort of tell you some of the questions that people have been asking in the LinkedIn forum, and so I'm going to read some of them. Actually, let's see. Let's pause this. Let's see. Yeah, somebody mentioned that they were surprised about the bias. So Jennifer says that she was surprised and less worried that she is biased, but she was surprised by the poll results uh, because just like me, I should probably run some sort of analysis on how many times I've been wrong with the poll, like how many times I pick not the top answer, because I think it's every time. I think it's every time. All right, so it says Michael says AI, but AI could study and become better and displace humans, or is that impossible? What are your thoughts of like AI being capable of
Yeah.
replacing humans? We talked about it. Do you think that's ever going to happen? Like, do you think,
My own personal opinion, I would say it's so improbable that I would classify it as impossible, in that in order for an AI to learn or become better, it takes a human. It takes human action to feed it more data. The little things in my Python notebook, the lines of code can't really escape that notebook and go pull new data from Google itself
mm,
if it wanted to. I think that unfortunately, some of the conversation around uh, artificial general intelligence is kind of all seeing AI is a little bit, it just doesn't match up to the the technical tools now. I think it's sometimes a
It's a
distraction.
reality. Sort of like when you go get like a burger at, like one McDonald's or Burger King, and it looks so good on that photo, but then you get it and it's like all smushed down, and it's, it tastes good, but it just doesn't look like it did. Yeah, I agree. I think that there, Robert's making a really good point here. He says that it can disrupt the education system, though. That's one place where I think it has some potential, I think, to have an impact. What do you think about some of the issues that the educational system is dealing with?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult because educators want to make sure that students are doing their work, not plagiarizing their work or using ChatGPT. And a lot of folks that are technical are like, ah, let them use it. But I think the fundamental issue is our current education system and the focus not so much being on problem solving
Hmm.
and critical thinking and being slightly more on rote memorization or regurgitation. I think that leads students to, if I can just find it online and that will suffice. I understand the student motivation, but I think we might have to reassess not just our assessments, but how the foundations of our educational system and why we aren't really testing students for their ability to think critically. And while that's changing, I think it really starts there because ChatGPT does pose a major implication on homework and on plagiarism.
Mm.
But I think we've got some broader issues to solve, and I think this tends to be common is that we will look at an industry or we'll look at a sphere of society like education and get a little hung up on how the technology is changing that without really moving the broader educational sphere forward and adapting to that technology.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, I mentioned before, like displacement. We're seeing kind of a shift in how people think about education and how, the way that we assess knowledge maybe needs to change to take into account that people can use some of these tools. And it's a challenge. I remember when I was teaching like web development, I took some courses in school. I remember just getting rid of tests, like actual, multiple choice tests, because I figured like they could just pull, they're taking these tests on their own, and they could just pull up the answers on the web, and that's what they would do in a normal job anyway. So maybe that's not the best indicator of whether or not they know something. So the way that I addressed it at the time is I said, okay, you can take the tests as many times as you want. So I'll make the tests, but you can take them as many times as you want. My only requirement is that you get 100 on the test always.
Mm,
Like take the test, it'll show you that maybe you got 80% of the questions correct. So there's 20% of the knowledge that you didn't know. But you can continue to take it as many times as possible. There's no limit to how long you can take it. But I want to make sure that you capture that 20%. You go research what it is you didn't know. And that worked well. At some point I just got rid of tests, and I just basically told them I'd rather see the projects that you do. That will tell me more about whether you know something, and I could read your code and see what you've done. I think that's a better. But now, we're talking about systems that can actually duplicate code and generate some of this code. So even in that instance, I mean, and it's just a process of rethinking how you're doing things. I think Jennifer Lee saying that that's the biggest challenge for educators. I spent a considerable amount of time over the break running all my assessments through ChatGPT, and realized that I needed to change some things. So that's part of the great thing about being a teacher, that you have that opportunity, but it does take a little bit of adjustment.
absolutely. And I think with just kind of reassessing what is a good test or what is a good way to
Hmm.
measure that something is learned. I think if we start over a little bit from there, we may come up with some different answers.
Yeah, we need to start considering some of these different frameworks, rethinking some frameworks for education. So this is a really great question. It's from Edmund Rowley Williams. He says, evidence has shown that social media algorithms have affected the way the brain functions. Among other things, exploiting addictive responses, thus can AI promise to do
Mm.
better? Like, do you think that that's maybe a place where AI can be actually beneficial? Good
I
question.
think this is a great question, and I think it's hard because it's hard to separate AI as we know it from the motivations of the companies that develop it.
Mm.
Social media has gotten worse intentionally. These companies
It's
have,
so good
like,
at driving like virality,
yeah,
and that's the problem with it, that it's only like it only thinks about how do I make these people be emotionally fulfilled, that they are getting likes, or and that does change the brain.
yeah.
Hmm.
One of the first
Crazy.
jobs in data science that I turned down ended up being at Facebook, and it was on their growth team. How do we increase time on page? How do we
Mm,
increase user engagement? And when we think about this, completely devoid of the human element, it's just business. But at the
mm,
same time, it's not like not all users are, your grandparents. There are kids on this. Like the
hmm.
addiction um, is intentional. And once we realize that, I don't necessarily think AI can promise better under the same conditions. So,
Mm,
lax regulation on social media, revenue and user engagement being the KPIs for revenue. I don't think it'll make it better given the conditions we have now. Maybe if those change, I
hmm.
do think that I don't think it'll be AI to help to fix the situation. I think it'll be a profit mindset
Yeah, or it
shift.
could be some regulation. I think that there is a place where regulation can maybe help, making sure that and the legal environment can also get into this, and we actually will have somebody talking about that in another show. So it's a the whole society needs to really consider when some of these things aren't good for people, and how to prevent some of the harmful side effects that these technologies tend to have on people. So I'm going to leave it with a couple of more really good comments here. Love this talk from Samantha. I love this from Rihanna. Says best practices take time. We're still on Earth, and I feel like we're gonna be fine. It's gonna be a process. These technologies are hitting us so fast, so quickly, that it can be a challenge, but we've come a long way. I think there have been benefits from that connectivity. I did a course on the history of full stack development, and it helped me remember that the goal of connecting people together was a good sort of goal at the beginning. And maybe at some point, just like we talked about education, rethinking about how they approach things, I think we just need to go through a process of considering how why we're doing things, when something is good. And I really do feel positive that we'll figure this out. So that's going to be like the last question. We're a little bit over time. Don't forget to like and subscribe in all the social media platforms that we appear. And please go to Ayodele's and mine's LinkedIn page, and you can connect with us. One thing you can do is, if you want to learn more about what we're doing, you can hit the notify button in our profiles, and that'll let you know whenever I post about new shows and new sort of episodes of the future in tech. And we have actually just started a new page. So you can go to linkedin.com/company, and it actually has a shorter URL. It's like the future in tech, and it'll take you to the same page. I'm going to put all of the previous episodes in here. And so if you want to know, next week we're talking, as I mentioned, to Andreas Welsh about the strategies, crafting the AI strategy for business. So this recording will be in there as soon as we're done. And like I said, we have some pretty exciting guests coming up. So if you want to get notified, I think the best way is just to follow that page. Yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe. Anything else you want to mention about what you're doing? Oh, I did want to touch on, you did send me a link that I didn't cover because I was saving it till the end. So I think you mentioned that you are working with this company called Vera, correct?
Yes. So some folks in the RAI space might know Vera as our former name, Parity, but we're really working on tools that leverage AI, leverage NLP and chatbots to help data scientists really consider some of these compliance and responsible AI tools and methods during the development process. So you can check out our website, and we're really looking forward to a lot of the work this year, both in the auditing space and both being and also being able to just help companies and help data scientists suss this out in within the notebooks that they develop models in as well.
Cool. Is there anything else that you would like to say just as a closing statement and make sure that I
Yeah.
haven't forgotten anything?
Yes, I would say my biggest piece of advice for people who are not necessarily developers is to stay and maintain critical. ChatGPT especially has the ability to write text that might fool you, but like really just be critical of the outputs from AI and don't really continue to take it at face value. I think that's one of the biggest things we can do is really making sure that we are critical and aware that these systems are everywhere. And unfortunately, they don't always tell us that.
That's so cool. I thank you so much. I so appreciate you coming on the show. Perhaps we can have you at some other point in time come back when I need a refresher on where some of these things. Maybe we could do like like a sort of callback on, a year from now and we can see what progress we've made. It's going to be super cool. I'm so happy to have you here. I have grown as a person just doing the research, and hopefully this helps somebody else consider some of these issues that, as developers, sometimes we're just too excited with the tech. We have to slow down,
Absolutely.
slow
Thank
down.
you so much for having me.
All right, take care, Ayodele. Good talking to you.
Nice